At my father's lavish wedding, he introduced me to his guests as just a security guard. Hours later, the big screen in the ballroom lit up with live footage of me in the smoke and chaos of the subway beneath the hotel, taking on armed men and pulling civilians to safety. The entire room went silent, and my father finally saw who his daughter really was. The ballroom was all chandeliers and satin and the soft clink of crystal, one of those rooms built to make people feel taller than they were. Vases of white peonies crowned every table. The string quartet tucked beneath a mezzanine played something tasteful and forgettable, and the waiters flowed like a silver river between the centerpieces. Laughter stacked on laughter. Compliments dressed as conversation. It was the kind of night that insisted nothing bad could possibly happen. Then the big screen over the bar, meant for a slideshow of the happy couple, blinked. The hotel's cable feed seized control with a red banner and a shrill two-note alert. The quartet faltered to a stop. Conversations thinned, then frayed, then died. Someone near the dessert table said, "Is there a game on or?" But the volume rose and the room fell into the television's light. Breaking news, the chyron screamed. Live images shook as a camera operator ran. Smoke boiled up a stairwell. Sirens webbed the audio with a distant, relentless cry. The anchor's voice was grave. "We are live at Midtown Central Station, following reports of an explosion. Repeat, an explosion, underground. Emergency services are on scene. We are seeing evacuations." The picture cut to the street outside the station, swarmed with flashing lights. A medic pushed a gurney through the grey air. 2 transit officers hauled a man with soot-caked cheeks toward an ambulance. Then the camera panned left, searching for the story within the story, and caught it. She came up from the station like a figure. The smoke had reluctantly returned. Tactical shirt darkened with soot, hair twisted into a no-nonsense knot, a triangle of blood blooming across her sleeve. Her left hand steadied a boy no older than 9. Her right arm wrapped around a woman whose face was streaked with the black tear tracks of a panic attack half survived. The camera found her and locked on, greedy, and for one beat the world stilled around her. You could sense it even through the TV, the way people in a crisis spot the person who has decided to be sure. "Who is that?" someone whispered. At the front table, the groom, Richard Williams, jawline like a ruling, turned at the sound of the screen and didn't look away again. He'd spent the cocktail hour ferried from circle to circle, cutting satin ribbons of small talk, his hand always finding the small of Eleanor's back like a claim. He was perfectly assembled, midnight tucks, cufflinks that carried a family crest, smile calibrated to put other men a rung below him on a ladder he alone recognized. He didn't believe in interruptions. The room did what he wanted, except the room wasn't listening to him now. It was watching the woman on the screen lift her chin and speak to someone off camera, lips moving with a crisp economy, every syllable a direction. "2 more up," she seemed to say. "I need air tanks and a backboard at the south stairwell. Kids first." The audio shredded in the gale of sirens, but the intent carried. Intent always does. Eleanor slipped her hand into Richard's elbow. "Oh my God," she murmured. "Look at her." He had the oddest sense of falling forward when he was perfectly still. The woman moved again, guiding her cluster of survivors through a knot of responders. She went back down. The camera lost her in smoke. A harsh cut put the anchor back on screen, earpiece jammed into her hairdo. "We're getting reports of a second device," she said, meaningfully careful. "This is still a developing situation. We want to remind viewers to avoid the area." The hotel's ballroom seemed to inhale and not exhale. You could hear the ice settling in glasses. Someone bumped the bar, and a line of champagne flutes chimed a fragile, accidental chord. In that small silence, a man at a side table let out a soft laugh that wasn't laughter at all. "That's Midtown," he said to no one. That's right under us. Please, a maitre d' murmured, instantly there, palm out as if he could stop panic with a gesture. Ladies and gentlemen, everything is under control. The hotel is secure. The camera cut back to the station. Smoke billowed from the steps. Firefighters crouched in a wedge, then pushed down like a tide going out. And then, there she was again, as if the building had decided to breathe her out a second time. She was dragging a metal barricade aside with a transit officer, eyes flaring as she scanned the crowd for something none of them could see. The blood on her sleeve had soaked darker. She didn't seem to notice. "What is she wearing?" a woman near the cake asked. "Is that police?" "No," said a man who knew uniforms the way some men know cars. "Private sector. Security." Richard's glass was cold between his fingers. He'd held it for so long that condensation had ringed his knuckles. He had a memory in the exact shape of what he was looking at. No, not a memory, a habit, and it did the choosing for him. He heard his own voice from an hour ago, casual as a shrug, as if smallness were a kindness. "My daughter, Samantha. She's just a security guard." Eleanor heard it too now. She turned her face toward him in a way that wasn't quite a look. "Richard," she said softly, warning or plea, he couldn't tell. The feed steadied and zoomed, hungry. The woman on screen, Samantha, tilted her head as if listening for danger, the way other people listen for their names. She pressed a radio to her mouth, then cut left, sprinting back down the steps into the fog of it. The camera operator swore. He stumbled after and the world became a blur of concrete and chaos, and the white-hot flicker of emergency lights ricocheting down tiled walls. A murmur rose in the ballroom, unscripted and human. "Why is she going back in?" a guest asked, voice thin around the edges. They said a second device. "Because that's what you do," said someone else, surprising themselves with the certainty in it. The picture pitched, then caught. The sound turned into a mess of orders. "Line! Line! Keep left clear." A dull boom rolled up the stairwell. Not thunder, not quite a blast either. More the sound of the city gritting its teeth. The camera shivered, cut to black for a heartbeat, then returned in a hail of pixels. Samantha emerged again, this time with an older woman whose legs weren't interested in moving. She almost lifted her, the way you lift a heavy thought, one shoulder, then the other. The right words in the right tone, and the body decides to trust you. "Is that blood?" The question moved like a draft. On screen, she handed the woman off to waiting arms and pressed her palm to her own sleeve, checking, confirming, dismissing. A paramedic tried to block her path back down. She shook her head once, calm and absolute, and pointed. He pointed somewhere else. She pointed again. He stepped aside. The camera caught the exchange and you could hear the anchor breathe. Wow, the way people do when they've just been told who's in charge and accept it. In the ballroom, a waiter took one step, realized he was in the sight line of 100 people, and froze. The quartet sat with their bows in their laps and stared at the TV like everyone else. An aunt in a sequined jacket put her hand to her chest and left it there. The Chiron changed. Security Officer Aids Evacuation, it read. Then the name typed itself into being, as if it were a confession the network had to make. Samantha Williams. A glass slipped, then shattered, the sound weirdly crisp under the muffled news audio. Richard didn't feel it leave his hand. He only knew it had broken because a circle of cold spread across the leather of his shoe. Champagne puddled at his feet, sticky sweet. He stared at the name as if it might accidentally belong to some other man's daughter. Eleanor's fingers tightened on his sleeve. "Richard," she said again, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was both a question and an answer. Across the room, a cousin who'd been introduced to Samantha the night before the usual way, just a security guard, leaned toward his wife. "He told me she checks IDs," he whispered, as if the whisper could be taken back. At, like, a campus or something. On the screen, Samantha paused at the top step. The camera, hungry for her face, grabbed it. You could see the soot slicking her cheekbones, a dark smear across her temple, where she'd reached up and touched herself without knowing. Her eyes, sharp, assessing, unafraid, flicked past the lens, past the crew, past the chaos, as if counting the way a pilot counts instruments. Exits, threats, resources, time. The anchor said her name again, more carefully now, as if the syllables had weight. Security Officer Samantha Williams has been coordinating evacuees, or someone clapped. One man, a reflex, the human urge to mark a thing that deserves marking. The sound sounded wrong in the swaddled room and died sorry for itself. But the feeling didn't die. It moved through the tables and made people's shoulders square. It softened the hard set of a few mouths. Richard didn't clap. He couldn't. He felt something crack in his chest, a shift like a building realizing it has been built on a fault line, and the earth is only now telling it the truth. He thought of the way he'd said God. The way he'd let the word mean small. He thought of all the times he had rewritten her as an afterthought, because the story of him needed it that way. The television, big and unafraid, told him another version, and did it without asking for permission. Samantha glanced toward the camera again, and for a dizzy blink of a second, the geometry of the shot lined up with the geometry of the room. Her face, larger than life, hovering over the bar, his face lifted to meet it. He could almost pretend she was looking straight at him. The feed hiccuped. There was a new edge in the anchor's voice. We're hearing reports, unconfirmed, of armed suspects inside the station attempting to control egress points. Repeat, this is unconfirmed, but law enforcement is responding as if there's a coordinated element. A ripple went through the ballroom. People looked at the doors the way trapped things do. A security manager from the hotel, tie loosened, radio belling at his hip, appeared at the back and lifted both hands. Everything is secure up here, he called, voice steady. We have additional personnel on the lobby level. Please remain calm. The camera dove again. Smoke swallowed half the frame. A man with a bandaged head stumbled into view and was caught by a firefighter. Samantha ran past, low and fast, the way you run when you've spent years learning to shorten the distance between danger and help. The lens tried to follow and lost her behind a wall of bodies in motion. Eleanor spoke without looking away. Richard, she said, and this time it was tender and something like scared. Say something. He swallowed. His mouth was paper. 100 introductions crowded his tongue. Just a security guard, and none of them fit anymore. He could feel 100 eyes tilting toward him, waiting to be told what to think, what to call her. For once, he didn't have a polished answer. He had only the truth, rising, stubborn as breath. He opened his mouth to say it, to name her right in front of everyone, when the picture on the screen stuttered and surged and then locked in on Samantha again. Only this time, she wasn't coming out of the station. She was turning around at the threshold, one hand braced on the rail, the other reaching behind her into the dark, as if she'd found someone the camera couldn't see. The anchor's voice went thin. We're going to stay with this live, she said, and in the ballroom, holding on to his next breath like it might be his last good one, Richard watched his daughter vanish into the smoke and knew the next thing they saw could change everything. If you've spent your whole life being told who you are, you start to believe it until something cracks in the mirror. My childhood was framed in the cold shine of my father's expectations. Richard Williams didn't talk about feelings. He talked about returns, portfolios, golf handicaps, and the kind of colleges that came with Latin mottos on their crests. In his eyes, value was measured in starting salaries and the square footage of the address on your business card. I was his only child, and I was supposed to be proof he'd done something right. But from the moment I stepped off his map, he treated me like a detour he couldn't brag about. My earliest memories of him are like photographs you find in someone else's album, posed, precise, but never quite warm. We'd stand in front of our sprawling house in Westchester for the annual Christmas card, his hand on my shoulder like a paperweight, both of us smiling for the camera, because that was the script. My mother, Linda, would be off to the side, coaxing me to stand still, her smile the only real one in the frame. They divorced when I was 12. By then, I understood enough to know it wasn't my fault, and not enough to stop wondering if it was. Mom said it was because he was never home, never present, and when he was miles away in his head. "Your dad loves you," she told me once in the kitchen as she kneaded dough. "But he loves the idea of success more." It wasn't meant to hurt. It just explained why weekends at his new apartment in the city felt like visits to a very elegant hotel, polite, distant, and over too soon. He had a plan for me that he spoke about as if it were already printed on a brochure. An Ivy League degree, law school, then a position at one of his friends' firms. "You're smart enough to do anything," he'd say, but what he meant was, "You're smart enough to do what I've decided." And for a while, I tried. I kept my grades high, joined the debate team, toured campuses with him in the spring. But when I told him at 17 that I was enlisting in the army after graduation, the look on his face was the same one he'd given a waiter who once brought him tap water instead of sparkling. "The army," he'd repeated, the word flat with disbelief. "Samantha, people from our background don't enlist. If they must serve, they go in as officers. They don't." He trailed off, searching for a word that wouldn't sound like an insult, but couldn't find one. I remember setting my fork down, hands tight in my lap, and saying, "I'm not doing this for you." His silence was sharper than anything he could have said. I shipped out the following summer, and for 4 years I learned how to move through fear without letting it see your face. I learned discipline that had nothing to do with GPA, leadership that had nothing to do with corner offices. But when I came home with an honorable discharge, all he saw was that I hadn't collected the degrees he'd ordered. I used my GI Bill to get a criminal justice degree, working part-time as a campus security officer, then moving up to private security. Every promotion, every certification, every commendation was met with a nod and the same sentence. "That's good, Sam. But when are you going to do something more?" It became a ritual, his introductions. At family events, business dinners, weddings of people I barely knew, he'd put a hand on my back and say, "This is my daughter, Samantha. She's a security guard. Not security professional, not threat assessment specialist, not former army. Just a security guard." The words were always delivered with a kind of lightness, as if trimming the truth into something smaller made it easier to swallow. People would smile politely, murmur, "Oh, interesting," and then pivot to talk to someone else. I learned to smile back and sip my drink, pretending it didn't matter. The only person who refused to let his words stick to me was my mother. She came to my award ceremonies, kept clippings of articles where my name appeared, and once told me, "Your dad sees the world through a keyhole. That's his problem. You're looking through the whole door." She sent me texts before big events, "Stay sharp, proud of you," and never once asked when I was going to do something else. Still, every time my father whittled me down to just a security guard, some part of me wanted to throw the truth in his face, to tell him about the diplomat I'd protected during a protest, the corporate espionage plot we'd intercepted, the long nights spent ensuring nothing happened on my watch, but I never did. Maybe I thought one day he'd ask. He never did. That's why standing in his ballroom now, watching the TV show, the kind of work he thought was beneath me, felt like the air had tilted. Because in that moment, with my name running across the screen, I knew he could never unknow what he was seeing. And yet, a question itched at the back of my mind. Would even this be enough for him to see me as more than the words he'd used all my life? I didn't get to find out, because that night, an envelope arrived at my apartment that would drag me right back into his world. The envelope was heavier than most, the kind of paper that had a faint tooth to it, like it had been made for a more important life than mine. It was sitting in the center of my small kitchen table when I came in from a late shift, the pale cream looking almost luminous under the dim overhead light. My name was written in calligraphy, real ink, not printed, and in the bottom corner was a return address that I recognized immediately. The Williams name was printed in understated serif letters, followed by an address in the heart of Manhattan's financial district. My father's office. Not his home, not a personal note, a business stamp. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a thick gold embossed card. Richard Williams and Eleanor Harrington request the honor of your presence. My eyes kept moving, but my mind caught on those two names side by side. I'd known he was engaged. Mom had mentioned it casually over coffee one morning, her voice deliberately neutral. Your father's marrying again. She's from that banking family. You'll read about it in the Times, I'm sure. I had a week later, when their engagement photo appeared in the style section, him in a custom suit, her in a sleeveless silk gown, both smiling like they were already posing for the next gala. The rest of the card was all logistics, the date, the time, the venue. A luxury hotel downtown, one of those glass and steel towers that rose straight from the subway, like they'd been poured there in one piece. The kind of place that made you whisper without knowing why. The reception would be held in the grand ballroom, with views of the skyline and, ironically, as it turned out, the train station just below. I set the invitation down and leaned back in my chair. My first instinct was to toss it in the recycling bin. Every time I'd been in his orbit lately, it ended with me feeling like I'd been weighed, measured, and found wanting. A wedding would just give him a bigger audience for the same performance. He'd introduced me to Eleanor's friends, to his partners from the firm, to cousins I hadn't seen in a decade, and every time he'd put his hand on my back and say it, "This is my daughter, Samantha. She's a security guard." I could hear it already, as if it were a pre-recorded loop. I poured a glass of water, but it tasted like nothing. The thought of walking into that room, of catching his eyes across the crowd, and knowing exactly what he'd say, was like swallowing something sharp. I was about to slide the envelope back together when my phone buzzed. Alicia's name lit up the screen. I hit answer and leaned against the counter. "Hey." Her voice came through in its usual bright rush. "Please tell me you're free to grab coffee tomorrow. I'm dying over here. My new boss is the devil." I laughed despite myself. "Sure, but I have something to show you." The next afternoon, we met at the cafe 2 blocks from my apartment, the one with mismatched mugs and a front window that fogged in winter. I slid the invitation across the table like it was evidence. Alicia's eyes widened. "Whoa, fancy. Is this—" "Yeah," I said. "It's Dad's wedding." She turned the card over in her hands, fingertips brushing the gold lettering. "So, are you going?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to just avoid the whole circus." Her brows pulled together. "Sam, it's your dad's wedding. Even if he's him, you should be there. At least for yourself." "For myself?" I stirred my latte, watching the milk eddy into the coffee. "I know exactly how it'll go. He'll introduce me as a disappointment in a dress, just with better lighting." Alicia set the card down, leaning forward on her elbows. "Then prove him wrong. Show up looking amazing. Be polite, be confident, and don't let him make you feel small. You've worked too hard for that." I wanted to tell her that proving him wrong wasn't the point, that I didn't need his approval. But the truth was, some stubborn part of me still hoped for it. "I don't know," I said. "It just feels like walking into enemy territory." "Maybe," she admitted, "but sometimes the best way to change the narrative is to walk right into the room and own it. You're not the same kid he tried to script a life for. You're the woman who's built her own. Let him see that, even if he doesn't want to." I sighed, sipping my coffee. Outside, people hurried by with their coats pulled tight against the wind, each of them on their own path. I thought about my job, about the security team I'd trained, about the conference we'd protected last spring, without a single incident. None of that would matter to him if it didn't fit into the story he wanted to tell. Still, I pictured walking into that ballroom in a dress that made me feel like steel wrapped in silk, with my head high. I pictured shaking hands, smiling, refusing to shrink. Maybe Alicia was right. By the time I left the cafe, the envelope was back in my bag instead of the recycling bin. I wasn't saying yes, not yet, but I wasn't saying no anymore either. That night, I placed the invitation on my nightstand, where it caught the lamplight like it had something to prove. And in the quiet before sleep, I realized the thing nagging at me most wasn't the thought of him seeing me. It was the thought of what might happen if he finally did. The welcome dinner was everything I expected it to be, and exactly what I dreaded. The grand terrace room on the 48th floor looked like a magazine spread, gold light from crystal chandeliers pouring over white linen, a skyline glittering through floor-to-ceiling windows. Waiters in black vests moved like they were choreographed, topping off glasses and gliding past with trays of canapés that looked too perfect to eat. A string trio in the corner played something delicate, just loud enough to be heard, but soft enough not to interrupt the gentle hum of high-net-worth conversation. I stood near the edge of the crowd with a glass of sparkling water, the stem sweating against my fingers. I'd picked the navy dress Alicia helped me find, sleek but not flashy, paired with silver earrings my mother had given me when I graduated from the academy. I felt, not beautiful exactly, but ready to make it through the night without letting him get under my skin. It took less than 10 minutes for that resolve to be tested. "Ah, Samantha," my father's voice carried across the room before I even saw him. He was approaching with a couple in their 60s, the man in a tailored charcoal suit, the woman in a pale pink sheath dress and pearls. "This is my daughter," he said, the same way someone might introduce a pet that didn't quite match the decor. "She's a security guard. Not a security professional, not former army, not senior operative, just a security guard." The words landed like they always did, small and flat, designed to take up less space than the truth. The woman blinked, clearly searching for something polite. "Oh, interesting," she said, her smile stiff. The man's brows lifted. "Richard tells us you were in the military." "Yes," I said, keeping my tone even. 4 years, Army. Now I specialize in event and executive protection." "Well," he said, nodding, "thank you for your service." He glanced at his wife, who gave me a tight smile, and then my father was already steering them away. I caught the tail end of the woman's voice as they walked off. A security guard. With Richard's connections, she could have been anything. I turned back to my drink, taking a slow sip. My father's words weren't new, but they still worked like a pinhole leak in my composure. You don't notice the damage until something gives way. The pattern repeated itself all evening. I was introduced to a banker from Boston, a partner at a law firm, Eleanor's cousin, who chaired a philanthropy board. Each time, the same 4 words: "She's a security guard." Sometimes with a shrug, like he was excusing me for not fitting the mold. Each time, I swallowed the urge to list my credentials, my commendations, the hundreds of hours I'd spent protecting people who'd never know my name. By the time the main course was served, my patience was threadbare. I excused myself to the restroom, phone in hand, and leaned against the cool marble countertop. I texted Alicia. "This was a mistake. He's introduced me as just a security guard to everyone here." Her reply came fast. "Remember why you're proud of what you do. His opinion doesn't change your value." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Easy for her to say from the outside. I'd spent years building something I was proud of. But somehow, he could still make it feel small with 4 words and a polite smile. When I came back, I found myself seated next to the event photographer, a man in his 30s with a camera strap looped across his chest. "Tough crowd," he murmured as he adjusted his lens. "You have no idea," I said. "I overheard one of your introductions," he admitted. "For what it's worth, I think security is more important than what most of these people do. I'd rather have someone who can protect people than another investment banker." His kindness caught me off guard, a small flare of warmth in the cool, polished room. I smiled. "Thanks." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite nods and half-heard conversations. I kept my glass full of water, not trusting myself to dull the edge with wine. My father laughed across the room, his arm around Eleanor's waist, perfectly at home in this world. I felt like an extra in someone else's movie. Back in my hotel room later, I sat on the edge of the bed, the city lights bleeding in through the curtains. My dress was neatly draped over a chair, my silver earrings in the dish on the nightstand. I thought about booking an early train home, skipping the ceremony entirely. It would be easy. No explanations, no scenes. But there was a small, stubborn part of me that hated the idea of leaving on his terms. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was defiance, maybe it was the hope, however naive, that tomorrow might be different. I turned off the lamp and lay back, the faint hum of the city filling the silence. My eyes closed, but my mind kept replaying his voice. "She's a security guard." And somewhere under that, a question I didn't want to admit was there. What if tomorrow gave him the perfect opportunity to say it one more time? The morning of the wedding was clear and cold, the kind of winter light that makes every surface look sharper. From my room on the 32nd floor, I could see the city spreading out in all directions, 1,000 windows winking back at me. Down on the street, yellow cabs glided in steady streams, disappearing beneath the hotel into the belly of the transit hub. Somewhere under all that steel and glass, the trains kept their own schedule, indifferent to the celebration happening above. I'd woken early without meaning to. The digital clock had barely clicked past 6 when my eyes opened, and sleep wouldn't come back. I tried reading, then flipping channels on the muted TV, but my mind felt restless, like my body was anticipating something I couldn't name. At 8, I gave up and pulled on a sweater, deciding a walk might shake it off. The elevator ride down was quiet, just me and a bellhop rolling a cart stacked with floral arrangements. In the lobby, a few guests milled around the coffee bar, hair still damp from the shower, dressed in athleisure instead of evening wear. I slipped past them toward the side corridor that led to the street, craving a little air before I had to wrap myself in the day's formalities. Outside, the wind cut sharp along the sidewalk, threading between skyscrapers like it was looking for trouble. I walked without a real destination, circling the block, eyes half on my phone and half on the world around me. The city had its own rhythm, and even on a weekend morning, the area around the hotel buzzed with the layered hum of construction noise, bus brakes, and the far-off growl of the subway. It was as I passed the service entrance on the far side of the building that I noticed them. 3 men, maybe mid-30s, each carrying a bulky duffel. At first glance, they could have been part of the catering crew, but something was off. The uniforms didn't match, not exactly. 2 had the hotel's charcoal grey vests, but the third wore a plain black jacket with no logo. Their shoes were wrong too. Thick-soled work boots where the others wore slip-resistant dress shoes. One of them caught me looking and offered a quick, too-bright smile. It didn't reach his eyes. Years of training teach you to catalogue the small details, even when you can't explain why they matter. The way they paused at the door, glancing up and down the alley before swiping a key card. The fact that the man in black didn't swipe his own, just followed the other 2 inside. The slight bulge in the side pocket of the duffel, heavy enough to pull the fabric taut. I slowed as I passed, pretending to check my phone, then caught a snatch of low conversation before the door swung shut behind them. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clipped, businesslike, not the easy chatter of co-workers starting a shift. Back on the main sidewalk, I turned toward the hotel's front entrance, telling myself it was nothing. I'd been in security long enough to know that not every odd thing was a threat. Sometimes a guy with the wrong shoes was just a guy with the wrong shoes. Still, the image stuck in my mind like a burr. Inside, the lobby had transformed overnight. Tall arrangements of white lilies and roses flanked the entrance, and a champagne display was being assembled in the corner. Staff moved briskly from one task to the next, radios clipped to their belts, earbuds in place. I hesitated by the bank of elevators, glancing once toward the hallway that led deeper into the service areas. I could follow up now, ask a few questions, flash my credentials. But I was a guest today, not on duty. My father would love the story of how I wandered into the kitchen, like I was still on shift. I told myself to let it go. In my room, I tried to refocus on the day ahead, dress steamed, makeup bag laid out, hair tools heating on the vanity. The ceremony was hours away, but I knew Eleanor would want guests seated early. My plan was simple: show up on time, smile politely, keep conversation light, and avoid giving my father any reason to trot out his favorite line. Still, when I glanced out the window toward the street below, I found myself looking for those 3 men. There was no sign of them now, just a steady stream of pedestrians, some with rolling luggage, others clutching coffee cups against the wind. I shook my head at myself and turned back to the mirror. My dress hung waiting, the silver earrings catching the light on the nightstand. I focused on the small things, curling each strand of hair, blending foundation until it disappeared into my skin. By the time the clock edged toward 3, I'd managed to push the morning's unease into the corner of my mind. But even as I headed for the elevator, clutching my small evening bag, the thought pressed in again. 3 men, wrong uniforms, heavy duffels, one without a keycard. And that look in his eyes, brief but assessing, like he was marking me in a crowd. The elevator chimed, doors sliding open to the grand hallway that led toward the ceremony. Guests in formal wear streamed past me, all heading in the same direction, laughter and perfume trailing in their wake. I fell into step with them, but in the pit of my stomach, something tight and cold told me this day wasn't going to unfold the way anyone expected. The ceremony was set to start at 4, but by 3:30, the garden terrace outside the ballroom was already filling with guests. The view stretched out over the glass and steel city, late afternoon light spilling between high-rises, warming the tops of buildings before it would sink into the Hudson. Rows of white chairs faced a floral arch, the kind you'd see in bridal magazines, roses, hydrangeas, and orchids braided together like a promise. String music drifted above the low hum of conversation, and waiters moved quietly among the crowd with trays of sparkling water and champagne. I found a seat in the back row, partly for the view and partly to avoid any more introductions. My dress felt right, the silver earrings cool against my neck, my posture deliberately straight. The scent of fresh flowers and expensive perfume mingled in the air, and for a moment I let myself relax, pretending this was just another wedding, one I could slip out of when the cake was cut. That's when I felt it, a faint vibration under my feet, subtle at first, like the rumble of a train you barely notice. I glanced toward the street below through a break in the railing. The traffic was moving normally. Taxis and delivery trucks, threading between pedestrians. Nothing seemed out of place. Then came the sound. A deep percussive thud from somewhere beneath us, followed a heartbeat later by a sharper crack, like metal giving way. The ground seemed to lift and settle again, a ripple moving through the terrace floor. Guests gasped, looking around. One of the floral arrangements trembled, petals breaking loose and falling to the stone. "What was that?" someone near me said, her voice high. A low hiss filled the air, and I realized it was coming from the building's ventilation grates. A thin plume of grey smoke curled upward, carrying the acrid tang of something burned and chemical. My training kicked in before my thoughts could. I stood, scanning exits, counting heads, noting the location of the nearest staff member with a radio. "Probably nothing," a man in front of me muttered, trying to calm his companion, but his eyes kept darting to the smoke. The string trio had stopped playing. The murmur of guests thickened, people shifting in their seats or standing to get a better look at the street below. Somewhere far down, at the base of the building, sirens began to wail. From my vantage point, I saw the entrance to the subway station across the street. A rush of people poured out, stumbling into daylight, some coughing, others shouting to each other. More smoke followed them, denser now, billowing into the crisp afternoon air. The sight yanked my stomach tight. On the terrace, the wedding planner hurried toward the officiant, whispering quickly before glancing at the hotel's head of security, who'd appeared at the edge of the crowd. His radio was in his hand, mouth set in a grim line as he listened. He started moving toward the building without addressing anyone, which told me more than if he'd made an announcement. I caught sight of my father at the front, Eleanor's hand in his. He was leaning toward one of his partners, trying to keep the conversation going, but even from a distance, I could see the stiffness in his shoulders. Eleanor glanced back, following the shifting attention of the crowd, her eyes finding the smoke rising from the street. A waiter near me muttered into an earpiece, "Yeah, we felt it up here. I don't know, maybe gas, maybe electrical." His voice dropped as he moved away, but I caught the word evacuation and felt my pulse notch higher. More guests were standing now, the chatter climbing toward panic. I stepped into the aisle, instinct overriding every polite boundary. I needed more information. Moving to the terrace railing, I looked down again. The scene at street level was changing fast. Uniformed transit officers had arrived, waving people back, while others disappeared into the station entrance. A fire truck pulled up, lights spinning, and the sirens grew louder. And then, through the swirl of movement, I saw them. 3 figures moving against the flow, heading not away from the station, but toward a side service door. 2 wore the hotel's charcoal vests. The third wore black. My breath caught. Same build, same stride, same too bright focus in their eyes as the men I'd seen that morning. The duffels were gone now, but their hands were empty in a way that was more suspicious than if they'd been carrying something. Empty like they were waiting to fill them. I gripped the railing, my mind running calculations. The blast had come from the subway level, right beneath the hotel. If they were heading inside now, it wasn't to help, and the smoke filtering up through the vents meant whatever was happening below could spread fast. The officiant's voice tried to cut through the noise, urging everyone to remain seated until they had more information, but people weren't listening anymore. Some moved toward the building's glass doors, seeking shelter inside. Others edged toward the elevators. The terrace had gone from hushed ceremony to chaotic crowd in less than 2 minutes. I turned back toward the aisle, scanning for hotel security. The head guard was nowhere in sight now, likely pulled inside by the radio chatter. I could follow the men, try to confirm what I suspected, but doing that would mean leaving this floor, moving into whatever was happening below. From the street came another sound, not as loud as the first blast, but sharper, like a contained detonation. Guests screamed, some crouching, others pulling out their phones. A thicker wave of smoke rolled up from the subway entrance, blotting out the view for a moment. I glanced toward my father again. He was on his feet now, Eleanor gripping his arm, both of them looking toward the building. His eyes swept the terrace, catching mine for just an instant before the crowd shifted between us. And in that instant, I knew the choice was already made. I was going after them. The moment my decision clicked into place, the noise around me faded into something distant, like I was hearing it through a wall. The terrace, the guests, the chatter, it all became background static. My focus tunneled down to the service corridor I had seen the 3 men disappear into. The only clear thought in my head was that if I hesitated, they'd be gone. I moved quickly, skirting the crowd, slipping through a side door that led into the main hotel interior. The difference in atmosphere hit instantly, from cool, open air to a tight hallway humming with fluorescent lights. The smell of flowers from the terrace was replaced by a harsher cocktail, cleaning agents, hot wiring, and faint smoke drifting in from somewhere deep in the building. A catering assistant nearly collided with me, arms loaded with folded napkins. "Ballroom's that way," she said, trying to redirect me. "I know," I told her, and kept going before she could press the point. I followed the signs for service elevators, moving past stacks of linen carts and cases of glassware. The building's innards had a different rhythm, hotel staff darting in and out of rooms, radios crackling in clipped bursts, a security guard speaking into his mic as he jogged toward the lobby. Nobody stopped me. Dressed as I was, I could have been anyone, another guest who'd gotten turned around. The service elevator doors opened just as I reached them, releasing two men in vests that matched the ones I'd seen earlier. They stepped aside without making eye contact, moving toward the loading dock. No duffels this time either, but both walked with their shoulders forward, like they were protecting space in front of their chests. I caught the door before it shut and stepped inside. The control panel showed a card slot for restricted floors. I jabbed the button for LL Transit Access and felt the car drop. The air grew heavier as we descended. When the doors slid open, the smell of smoke wrapped around me, thicker now, cut with the metallic tang of overheating machinery. Dim light from flickering fixtures bled across concrete walls. Somewhere far down the corridor, I could hear the sound of rushing footsteps and the low echo of voices. I moved toward it, keeping my footfalls light. The lower service level connected the hotel to the underground concourse above the subway. It was a maze of storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and narrow hallways that eventually opened to the public platforms. Down here, there were no crowds of wedding guests, just a handful of transit staff, some trying to get equipment out, others arguing in tense voices about how to shut down a section of the station. Through a side doorway, I spotted them. 3 men, 2 in vests, and the one in the black jacket, standing near a locked maintenance gate. One of them was kneeling, working on the padlock with something small and fast. The other 2 kept glancing up and down the hallway. I stepped into the shadow of a support beam, leaning just far enough to watch. One of them muttered something, low but urgent. The man in black pulled a small radio from his pocket, pressing it to his mouth. I couldn't hear his words over the sudden boom of something heavy falling in the distance, but the tone, short, sharp, sent the hairs on my neck up. The kneeling man popped the lock, and they slipped through the gate. I waited a count of 3, then followed, easing the gate shut behind me without letting it click. The space beyond was narrow and unfinished, lit by a single bare bulb. It led toward the muffled roar of the subway below. As I edged closer, the smell of smoke deepened, joined by another scent, acrid, like burning insulation. The corridor ended at a stairwell that dropped into a service platform. From here, I could see the chaos in pieces. Commuters huddled against walls, transit officers waving people toward an emergency exit. A medic bent over someone lying on the floor. And moving through it, fast and purposeful, were the 3 men. They weren't helping anyone. They were scanning. Their eyes moved the way predators do, target to target, assessing for weakness. The one in black had something strapped under his jacket now, its outline just visible when he shifted. My pulse thudded in my ears. I'd been in enough bad situations to know this one was turning. Whatever the blast had been, it wasn't the end of the plan. It was the opening. And these 3 were headed deeper, toward the tunnel access where most people wouldn't think to go. A small movement near the far wall caught my attention. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, crouched behind a trash bin. His hands clutched the straps of a backpack like it was armor, his face pale under the grime of smoke, his eyes locked on mine, wide and desperate. I took one step toward him, but the man in black turned his head, just enough that I froze. If he saw me now, I'd lose any advantage I had. The boy's lips moved, please. And in that split second, I knew I couldn't just track the suspects anymore. There were civilians in here, scattered, hiding, and these men were hunting. I glanced back toward the stairwell, calculating distance, timing, exits, and as I stepped out from behind the beam, every instinct in my body screamed that whatever I did next would decide whether anyone on this platform made it out alive. The smoke clung to the back of my throat, the kind that doesn't just sting. It scratches, a reminder with every breath that you're somewhere you shouldn't be. The boy was still frozen behind the bin, eyes locked on me like he wasn't sure if I was real or just something he wanted to be real. His knees were drawn up, sneakers scuffed and untied, a tear in the cuff of his jeans. I crouched low, keeping one eye on the men moving deeper into the tunnel and one on him. "It's okay," I said quietly, my voice pitched just for him. "I'm here to help." He hesitated, then shook his head almost imperceptibly. I realized he wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of being seen moving toward me. I shifted so my body blocked him from the men's line of sight. "We need to get you out of here," I murmured. "Do you know where your mom or dad is?" "My mom, she ran that way," he whispered, pointing toward the smoke-dense far platform. I couldn't keep up. Behind us, a new wave of sound rose, shouts, a metallic clatter. One of the suspects had pushed past a transit officer, sending him into a wall. The other two were now splitting off, one disappearing into a maintenance alcove, while the man in black moved toward a cluster of passengers huddled near a stairwell. My gut told me they weren't just here to frighten people. They had a specific goal, and chaos was their cover. I tapped the boy's arm. "When I say run, you head for that exit sign, okay? Don't stop for anything." He nodded, swallowing hard. I rose just enough to scan the crowd. To my left, a woman in her 70s was leaning against a column, a hand pressed to her chest, her breath short and shallow. Panic attack, maybe, or worse. A younger woman, her granddaughter maybe, was trying to calm her, eyes darting around for help. A few feet away, a transit employee stood frozen, phone in hand, looking between the suspects and the people he was supposed to protect. The man in black spotted the older woman and started moving toward her with a deliberate, unhurried gait, like he was certain no one would intervene. I stepped into his path before I could overthink it, my hands loose at my sides, but my voice steady. "She needs medical attention," I said, my tone sharp enough to register over the din. "Let her go." He stopped, eyes flicking over me. "You with the cops?" His voice was calm, but his right hand hovered near his jacket, where I knew the outline of a concealed weapon was. "No," I said. "I'm just someone who doesn't want to watch a woman die here." A half smirk tugged at his mouth. "Then walk away." "I can't do that." I let my stance shift subtly, weight over the balls of my feet. "If she collapses, you're looking at more than robbery charges. You really want that?" For a moment, he held my gaze, and the noise around us seemed to mute. Then, with a jerk of his chin, he veered off toward the far stairwell, either deciding she wasn't worth the trouble, or that I was. I crouched next to the older woman, speaking low. Deep breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Her pulse was rapid under my fingers, but her color was holding. I motioned for her granddaughter to keep her moving toward the exit. The boy was still where I'd left him, knuckles white around his backpack straps. I jogged back, took his hand, and guided him toward the emergency exit door. The transit worker, who'd been frozen before, finally snapped into action, holding the door open for us as we slipped through into a dim, narrow stairwell. At the top, the air was cleaner, though the muffled sounds of chaos below bled up through the walls. I pointed the boy toward a cluster of first responders. "Go to them, tell them you were separated from your mom. They'll help you find her." He looked like he wanted to say something, but then he just nodded and ran. I leaned against the wall for a half second, letting my lungs pull in fresher air before I turned back toward the stairwell. My work down there wasn't done. The suspects were still active, and now I'd seen enough to know they weren't just opportunists. There was intent, coordination, and probably more of them. Halfway down the steps, I heard a shout, one of those sharp, urgent sounds that cut straight through your chest. A man's voice, followed by a brief, panicked scream. I reached the landing, heart pounding, and saw through the smoke-hazed doorway that one of the suspects had a transit employee pinned against the wall, a blade pressed just below his chin. And beyond them, the man in black was opening a side hatch that led somewhere even deeper into the station. Whatever they were after, they were about to get it, unless I stepped in now. The suspect's knife gleamed in the dim light, its edge pressed just enough into the transit employee's throat to leave a pale line on his skin. The man's eyes were wide, fixed on the blade, his breath coming in short, shallow pulls. The suspect holding him was smaller than the man in black, but wiry, with a face that gave nothing away, not fear, not anger, just a flat readiness to do what needed doing if anyone got too close. A few feet beyond them, through a haze of smoke and half-light, the man in black was working the hatch. I could see his fingers moving fast, unfastening a heavy latch before leaning his shoulder into the steel panel. It groaned on its hinges, revealing a space beyond, dark and cavernous, the kind of restricted access where you could stash just about anything without being found for hours. I didn't know what they had hidden down there, but every instinct I had screamed that whatever it wasn't meant to stay hidden for long. I stepped inside the doorway, keeping low and letting the chaos on the platform cover my movement. A group of passengers was being herded toward an emergency stairwell by 2 transit cops, one of whom caught sight of me. His mouth opened to shout something, but I shook my head once sharply, and he seemed to get it. He turned back to the crowd, keeping their focus away from me. My hand brushed the phone in my pocket. I could call it in, get back up, wait for the odds to shift in my favor. But waiting meant giving the man in black the time he needed to finish whatever he'd started. I took a slow step forward. The suspect with the knife shifted his weight, tightening his grip on the transit worker's collar. "Stay where you are," he barked without even looking at me, like he'd already sensed I wasn't one of the panicked. "Let him go," I said, my voice steady but not loud. I didn't want to draw more eyes our way. Not yet. The man's jaw flexed. "Wrong place, wrong time, lady. Turn around and forget you saw anything." "Can't do that." His eyes flicked to me now, sizing me up. I could almost feel the calculation behind them, whether I was bluffing, whether I was a threat worth dealing with, or just another problem to shove aside. Behind him, the man in black had one hand inside the hatch now, feeling around for something. His other hand reached into his jacket, and when it came out, it was holding a compact submachine gun. That image locked into my brain like a photograph, an unshakable, undeniable escalation. There was no more time to debate. I shifted my weight forward, planting my right foot. "Hey," I snapped, loud enough to pull both their eyes toward me. In that fraction of a second, the knife wielder's grip loosened just enough. I lunged, grabbing his wrist and twisting hard, driving my other hand into the inside of his elbow. The knife clattered to the floor, and the transit worker bolted sideways, stumbling toward the stairwell. The suspect recovered fast, swinging a punch toward my ribs, but I'd already pivoted. I drove my shoulder into his chest, shoving him backward into a steel support beam. His head hit with a dull thud, his knees buckling. I didn't wait to see if he stayed down. The man in black had heard the scuffle, but instead of coming toward me, he ducked deeper into the hatch. I ran for him, closing the distance just as he started to lift something from the darkness. A heavy duffel, the kind I'd seen that morning. "Don't," I said, breathless but firm, my hands up in a half-guard. He glanced at me once, and there was nothing in his expression except certainty. Too late. He swung the bag over his shoulder, the weight of it obvious in the way it pulled at his frame. Then, without breaking eye contact, he He started backing into the darkness of the hatch. I took a step toward him, and he shifted his gun into view, the muzzle finding the center of my chest. For a second, all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. My training told me to assess the angle, the distance, the likelihood I could close the space before he pulled the trigger. But my instincts told me something else, that whatever was in that bag was worse than the risk of him firing now. I drew in a breath, ready to move, to take that gamble, when a deafening crack split the air. For a heartbeat, I thought he'd fired at me, but the sound came from somewhere deeper in the tunnels, a sound I recognized with bone-deep certainty. It was another explosion. The second blast rolled through the tunnels like a metal animal waking, a low-bellied growl that rattled bolts and ribs. Dust came down in a soft grey rain. The man in black flinched, just enough. I moved. My left hand snapped to the barrel of his gun, pushing it hard offline. My right tore the duffel strap off his shoulder. He recovered quicker than most, twisted, drove an elbow toward my face, but I dipped, felt it shave the air over my ear, and drove my knee into his thigh. He stumbled into the hatch, the subgun clacking against the steel frame. A scream rose at the far end of the platform and snapped me back into the room we were in, the one with civilians and smoke and time running out. "Drop it," I said, breath hot in my throat. He didn't. He tried to raise the weapon again and found nothing but my grip and his own bad angle. I slammed the muzzle into the hatch rim. The impact jarred his wrist. The gun fell. He went for the duffel instead, like that was the only prize that mattered. I kicked it behind me, felt the hard, ugly weight of whatever was inside. We both knew there wasn't time for a second fight. The transit cop who'd caught my eye earlier chose his moment. He barreled in from the blind side, tackling the man in black around the waist. They went down hard, skidding across grit. The smaller suspect I'd put into the beam tried to rise. I stomped his wrist before he could get clever. "Knife," I called, and the cop's partner scooped it with a boot and sent it skittering into the dark. "Evac now," I shouted over the radio chatter and the cough of the ventilation. I didn't know whose radio I was talking to. I only knew the tone that makes people move. "South stairwell. Keep left clear. Older adults first, then kids. Keep them low." The platform loosened at the edges as bodies surged in the direction of order. I swung the duffel up, hissed when it bit my shoulder. There was a rhythm to panic. Even it will follow something that sounds like certainty. I set that rhythm, handed it to the transit cops with a look that meant I trusted them to keep it. Their eyes said go. I grabbed the arm of the transit employee the knife had been on. He was shaking, color high, bravado trying to return. "You good?" He nodded, swallowed. Yeah. "Find the unlock for the east egress," I said. "Full open, then keep your head down." He sprinted, finding his job like a path he'd forgotten in a storm. The older woman I'd coached earlier appeared in the crowd, guided by her granddaughter, both moving better now. The boy I'd sent up must have made it. There's a kind of silence that follows the worry you let go of on purpose. A medic materialized next to me. "You bleeding?" he asked, already reaching for my arm. "Later," I said, shaking him off. "We have a bag we don't like." He looked at the duffel, swore under his breath. "Bomb squad's 2 minutes out." "Then we have one," I said, and his eyes met mine with the grim humor of people who know math. We cleared a circle around the hatch and the bag, kept the current of evacuees flowing. The man in black was on his knees in flex cuffs now, glowering like people do when they've trained their whole lives to never consider losing. He watched me the way a storm watches land. I watched the crowd. That's when the first camera found me. Not the news van on the street yet. This was smaller, closer, meaner. A phone, high above a shoulder, live streaming the kind of human mess the internet eats for breakfast. It caught me pointing, caught me herding, caught me shoving a barricade into place and telling a man twice my size to follow the line or get out of the way. Then the second camera found me, this one on a press stringer who'd muscled past the outer cordon and smelled a story worth a bruise. He swung his lens like a searchlight and it snagged me. And suddenly there I was, framed by smoke and rails and the bruised light of the emergency fixtures. A strange, accidental center of gravity. I didn't know it, not then, not down where the air tasted like pennies, but upstairs, the ballroom's cable feed cut from a generic anchor to that stringer's live hit. The slideshow at the bar vanished. The red banner blinked into place. Breaking news. The quartet set their bows down without meaning to. Conversations trailed into the carpet. And someone, I'd learn later it was the maitre d' hands shaking, found the remote and turned up the sound as if volume could keep the wolves out. I ran the evac like a drill I'd rehearsed 100 times and never thought I'd need under my father's wedding. Knee bent, voice even, eyes everywhere at once. The medic and I created a route through debris with 2 overturned signs and a single piece of yellow tape. He muttered vitals. I handed him people who needed him. Somewhere behind me, the bomb squad clanked down the stairwell like a machine with a heartbeat. "Williams," a transit sergeant barked, reading my name off the badge looped at my neck, but it felt like he was calling me back from a place I'd go if I let the adrenaline drive. "We got your back. Keep 'em moving." "Copy," I said, and then louder to the platform. "You're okay. Eyes here. Keep your hand on the shoulder in front of you. Breathe." On the screen above the cake, the camera found my face for the first time. It wasn't flattering. Sweat slicked with soot, a black smear across my cheek where I dragged my hand. My hair had come half out of its pin. The cut on my forearm leaked down to the cuff of my sleeve and turned it a deeper color. If you paused it, you could see the moment between one decision and the next, the bare, human calculus of risk running through my eyes. Then I moved again, and the room upstairs moved with me, forward, even if all they did was lean. I heard the bomb squad captain's voice, like a bell in fog. "We're good on the bag," he said. "Timer remote capable. You just bought us the minute we needed." "Tell me you can freeze it," I said. "We can make it quiet," he said, and there was enough weight in it that my lungs let go. 2 minutes. I nodded, stepped back, rolled my shoulders once. The man in black watched that nod. I let him. Then I went back to the work of making sure strangers didn't die. Upstairs, the anchor's tone shifted from caution to awe. "Assisting first responders," she said, "directing evacuees." A new line crawled across the bottom of the screen as some producer in a van somewhere decided my name should be a fact. The country heard. Samantha Williams, security officer. A beat later, after someone did a quick search and a braver edit, security expert. In the ballroom, a single flute slipped from a hand that hadn't realized how hard it was holding on. The glass shattered, champagne fan danced across polished leather shoes. Richard, my father, didn't feel the cold at his ankles. He was busy learning a different language without a teacher. The language of watching your story compete with someone else's truth and lose. "Is that?" Eleanor's voice barely rose past the hush. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He stared at the screen like it might answer a question he'd never asked. A cousin who'd met me the night before coughed, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Someone else said my name softly, as if saying it wrong might break it. On the platform, the squad finished what they came to finish. "Clear," the captain said into his mic, and the way his shoulders dropped told me more than the word. He squeezed my upper arm once, a professional thanks, and I finally let the medic peel back my sleeve. The cut was clean and cranky. He taped it fast, working with the brisk tenderness of people who don't waste the kind of care that matters. "You sure you don't want transport?" he asked. "I want sunlight," I said, managing a crooked smile, and he barked a short laugh that washed the worst taste out of my mouth. Movement at the stairwell drew my eye. 2 plainclothes officers were threading down, badges out. One of them lifted a hand toward me, a question wrapped in a gesture. I shook my head later and pointed them to the man in black. They went, and he gave them that same flat look, like he'd trained to hate people with questions. I started for the steps, needing air that hadn't been borrowed and reheated 3 times. The stringer followed, lens hungry. Miss, can we— What's your name? He called, breathless, as the camera tried to keep pace. Not today, I said without anger. Just, what are you? Are you NYPD? Private? He was jogging backward up the stairs in front of me, an awkward dance that would have been funny if everything else weren't so capable of breaking. Security, I said, and kept moving. He blinked, processing the smallness of the word against what he'd just filmed. Security, he repeated into the lens, but his eyes said more. The stairwell spit me into daylight that felt like a benediction. The street was a blaze of sirens and cordons, and people with jobs to do. A paramedic pressed a bottle of water into my hand, and I realized my mouth had been dry for a century. I drank, I breathed. For the first time since the first blast, I let the world be bigger than the tunnel. Then a hotel staffer, red vest askew, appeared at my elbow, startled to find himself touching the center of someone else's story. Miss Williams, he said, breath catching on my name. The ballroom. They have the news on, everyone can see you. He glanced up toward the tower of glass, unsure of the boundary between mercy and message. Your father is asking if you can come up. In the ballroom, on the screen above the cake and the orchids and the future he'd built to the millimeter, my face was still there, rimmed in smoke and certainty. Richard took one step toward it, toward the TV, toward the idea he'd never once let himself hold, and then, looking like a man stepping onto a bridge he'd mocked from the shore, he finally said my name out loud. I turned toward the revolving doors, the staffer's hand drifting away, the cameras still pulling at the edges of my coat, and felt the room I'd left hours ago rising to meet me. Because the next thing out of my father's mouth would either fix something that had been broken a very long time, or break it for good. The elevator ride back up to the ballroom felt longer than the one that had taken me down into the smoke. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked like someone I half recognized, hair coming loose, streaks of soot, a makeshift bandage around my forearm where the medic had taped me up. My dress was wrinkled and smudged in ways no dry cleaner could entirely fix. I had walked through fire, literally, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever kind of fire waited for me at the top. When the doors opened, the first thing I saw was the light, soft, golden, almost unreal after the harsh fluorescence and emergency strobes below. The second was the hush. Conversation stilled as heads turned, and for a moment the clinking of cutlery and glassware was the only sound in the room. Then I heard it. My name, spoken not in the clipped, detached way my father had used for years, but in a tone that carried both disbelief and something else I couldn't name yet. Richard was standing near the head table, Eleanor at his side, his hand still curled loosely around a champagne flute he wasn't drinking from. His posture was all wrong for him, shoulders not squared to the room, but angled toward me, as if the rest of the guests had faded, and I was the only one left. I walked forward slowly, not because I was unsure of my steps, but because I needed the time, needed to see the subtle shifts in the faces I passed, people who had smiled politely at just a security guard the night before, now watching me as though they were seeing me for the first time. Their expressions were a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and something close to apology. Eleanor broke from Richard's side before I reached them. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, her carefully composed face softening as she drew closer. Samantha, she said, and for the first time since I'd met her, my name didn't sound like she was trying it on for size. How's your arm? It'll heal, I said. They just stitched it up. She hesitated, as if there was more she wanted to say, then simply nodded. Good. I think Richard wants to talk to you. I almost laughed at that. How strange it felt to hear someone else speak about my father wanting to talk to me, as though it were a rare event worth noting. But I kept my face neutral and stepped past her until I was standing in front of him. Up close, I could see the way his eyes lingered on the soot marks along my cheek, the bandage, the tear in my sleeve. There was a flicker of something like shock in them, as if he'd expected the person from the news footage but wasn't quite prepared to see her in the flesh. "You're hurt," he said, and it wasn't a question. "It's nothing serious," I replied. Silence stretched between us, thick enough that I could feel the weight of every person in the room leaning toward it. Then he cleared his throat. "The police they said you saved lives down there." I shrugged, a small, tight movement. "I did what I'm trained to do." His mouth pressed into a line, and I couldn't tell if it was from pride or regret. "Including possibly mine," he said finally, his voice low. "And Eleanor's." For years I'd imagined hearing something like that from him, an acknowledgement, even grudging, that what I did mattered, but standing there now, I realized it wasn't the words themselves I wanted, it was the years they hadn't been spoken. "I was just doing my job, Dad," I said, "even if you've never thought much of it." That landed like a stone dropped into deep water. His face shifted, the practiced composure cracking just slightly. "I didn't understand," he said, and I almost laughed again, because that was the understatement of a lifetime. "You never asked," I replied. "Not once in 7 years have you asked what I actually do. You decided my career was beneath you, and that was that." He glanced away, just for a moment, as if looking at me directly, while hearing that was too much. "I thought you were working security at stores, concerts. I didn't know that it's real work," I cut in, "that it requires skill, training, judgment, that it's not about standing still and looking intimidating." His jaw tightened, but he didn't fire back. "I made assumptions," he admitted. "Wrong ones, and I think I let those assumptions become a way to keep my distance." I felt the air shift between us, the way it does when two people both know they're standing at the edge of something that could change them. "That distance was your choice," I said quietly. A murmur ran through the room as someone turned the TV volume up again. Over his shoulder, I could see my own image still playing. Grainy security camera footage now, showing me grabbing the duffel from the man in black, pushing people toward the exits. The sound of the anchor's voice carried, coordinating with law enforcement, preventing further casualties. He followed my gaze, watched the screen for a long moment, then looked back at me. "You've been this person all along, haven't you?" "Yes," I said. "The only thing that changed is that now you can't ignore it." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, but something that hinted at one. "You're right." I thought that might be the end of it, that he'd stop there and turn back to his guests. But instead, he took a step closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "I don't want this to be the only time we talk like this. I can't take back the years, but maybe I can start seeing you as you are." For the first time all day, I didn't have an immediate response. I didn't know if I trusted that he could change, or if I even needed him to. But I knew he was offering something he'd never offered before. The possibility of meeting me halfway. Before I could decide what to say, a figure in a dark suit appeared at the edge of the crowd, a detective, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. He started walking over, with the kind of purpose that meant whatever came next wasn't going to wait. And in that moment, standing between my father and the man who'd come looking for me, I realized the day wasn't done testing me. The detective reached me before my father could say another word. He was tall and solid, his suit rumpled in the way that happens when someone's been on their feet for 16 hours. He introduced himself, showed me his badge, then glanced around the ballroom like he wasn't quite sure what to do with all the flowers and fine china. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't really sorry. We need a little more detail for our report while everything's still fresh. I nodded, half turning to my father. I'll be back. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like he'd learnt not to argue with me in uniform, no matter how invisible mine might be under the soot and silk. The detective led me into a quiet side room off the main hall. The noise of the reception dulled behind the door, replaced by the low hum of the hotel's ventilation. He offered me a seat at a round conference table and clicked his pen. Walk me through it, start to finish. Just what you saw and did. We'll get the rest from the other witnesses. I gave him the sequence: morning sighting of the suspects, the first blast, the service corridor, the bar, the older woman, the knife, the duffel, the second explosion. I didn't embellish, but I didn't soften anything either. He kept his notes tight, nodding at certain points, his pen pausing when I mentioned the concealed weapon and the hatch. When I finished, he tapped his pen against the notepad. You realize, he said, if you hadn't intervened, we'd be talking about a very different kind of casualty count. I realize, I said, but the words felt heavier than they should. He closed his notebook, slipped the pen into his jacket pocket. The department's already talking commendation. Civilian Bravery Award. You might get a call from the mayor's office. I shook my head. I didn't do it for that. I know. His voice softened just slightly. But you should understand, not everyone with your training would have stepped in. That says something about you. He left me with his card and a handshake that lingered a second longer than formality required. When the door shut behind him, I sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle in. The day had been a sprint from one moment to the next, but here, in this little bubble of stillness, the truth of it finally caught up. I'd walked into danger without thinking twice, because walking away had never been an option for me. When I stepped back into the ballroom, the reception had thinned. Some guests had left early, maybe unsettled by how close the chaos had come. Others were still milling, their conversations low and looping back to what they'd seen on the news screen earlier. My father was alone now, Eleanor off speaking to a small group by the bar. He spotted me and came forward, weaving between tables. How'd it go? He asked. Just follow-up questions, I said. He hesitated, then gestured toward the terrace doors. We stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city stretched below, its hum constant, as if nothing had happened beneath its surface today. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I meant what I said earlier, he began. About wanting to see you as you are. I know I've been blind to that for a long time, too long. I studied his face, the lines deeper than I remembered, maybe because I was seeing them without the filter of my resentment. You don't have to say that because of what happened today, I told him. I'm saying it because I should have said it years ago, he replied. Today just took away my excuse. Something in me eased at that. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the weight of always waiting for him to notice was lighter. Inside, the hotel staff were beginning to clear tables, candles flickering low in their holders. I told him I'd be leaving soon. There was nothing left here for me to do, and I needed to clean up, rest, maybe process. He didn't argue. An hour later, I was in the back of a cab headed across town when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I think you dropped this earlier. You should have it back. Attached was a photo of a delicate silver pendant, mine, the one my mother had given me after my first big security contract. I hadn't even realized it had slipped off in the scramble underground. The sender's name followed. The woman you helped at the station. I stared at the message until the cab hit a red light and the driver glanced at me in the rear view. Good news? He asked. Yeah, I said, pocketing the phone. Good news. Weeks later, I would meet her in a coffee shop not far from the station. She'd pressed the pendant into my hand, her eyes damp, as she told me what it had meant to see me step in. To make her feel safe when everything was falling apart. I would wear it again, not as a reminder of the danger, but of the choice I'd make every time, no matter who believed in me or not. 1 year from that day, I'd stand in front of a crowd at a charity gala, invited to speak about security and preparedness. My father would be in the audience, listening, not to the idea of who I should be, but to the truth of who I was. And as I scanned that crowd, I'd see something else. A man just inside the doorway, watching me with the sharp, cold stillness I recognized instantly. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. It was the man in black. What would you have done if you were in my place that day? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want more real stories of courage, family, and unexpected twists, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.